Hi there, Michael.
Hi Laura, how are you?
I'm great, thanks for asking. And welcome everyone to our webinar on radio approvals for the EU's Radio Equipment Directive and also the UK radio regulations. Today we'll be focusing on radio modules. My name is Laura Llewellyn and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our expert, Michael Darby. Michael is the Technical Director for our Global Connected Technologies Division within Edmund. He has worked as a manufacturer, test engineer and certification body. Michael is a notified body for the EU and an approved body for the UK. He is an active member of the EU Notified Body Group, responsible for many technical papers on the topic of radio approvals and integration of radio into other equipment. He is also an active ETSI member, a contributor to ETSI standards, and Technical Secretary of the EMC Test Lab Association. He provides education and training activities, including webinar and seminar workshops. Before I hand you over to Michael, I just wanted to encourage everyone to submit any questions you have on the GoToWebinar panel to the right-hand side of your screen. And if you do lose connection for any reason, please refresh your browser or re-enter the GoToWebinar platform. Thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll now hand over to Michael.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Laura. I'll now share my screen. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to my webinar on the Radio Equipment Directive and UK radio equipment regulations for radio modules and module integration. Now, as Laura said, my name is Michael Darby, and I'm Technical Director here at Element Materials. My background is I started work in the EMC world and engineering world in the late 1980s, working for a manufacturer, doing some EMC testing and fixing their EMC failures. I then worked for commercial test labs and certification bodies for the most of my career in the UK and the USA in EMC and radio. Most recently, I've been doing a lot of training, webinars, seminars, and solving people's compliance problems. And most of the problem solving sessions have been related to radio modules. So who are you? Who do we have out there on the webinar today? Maybe this is you. Maybe you are the radio engineer. You know exactly how the radio works. You designed it, you built it, you understand exactly how it works, how the antenna is connected and what it does. Or maybe this is you. Maybe you don't know exactly how it works. Maybe you've never even seen the radio until now, but somehow the radio seems to be part of your situation, and somehow you seem to get into all of the adventures and all of the trouble seems to happen to you, even though you didn't even make the radio. Whichever one you are, this webinar is for you. So why am I talking about radio modules all the time? Well, it's a wireless world. People want their devices to be wireless enabled. We hear terms like the Internet of Things, machine-to-machine communications, and this is the desired life stuff for us, where all of our equipment will be interconnected with each other. But manufacturers of these things are not necessarily radio experts. When I first started radio testing, the customers who would come to me were manufacturers of radio equipment. It was only a radio, and they came to me and said, "It's a radio. That's what it does. Please test it and certify it." Nowadays, however, people have other types of products and they want to put a radio inside it. That means maybe hiring a radio engineer or a whole team of radio people. This is a challenge for our industry, whereby people want to wirelessly connect all sorts of equipment, which traditionally would not be known as a radio equipment. And the solution, therefore, is that we have some people who make radio equipment and then other people who make other products, and then they install the radio equipment into their products to make it a wireless device. So the goals for today then. Firstly, we're looking here at radio module use for Europe. When I say Europe, I mean the EU and the Radio Equipment Directive, and the UK or Great Britain for the UK's radio equipment regulations. We're going to look at life through the eyes of the radio module manufacturer. So what is a CE marked radio module and what does that really mean? And then we're going to look at radio enabled equipment, such as its other equipment, which become wireless by installing a radio module. So what is a radio module? If I say radio module, what do you immediately think of? Probably it's something like this. It's kind of a small device. You know, it looks like a module and you can tell it's a radio, and it's obviously built with the intention of going inside some other equipment. You can see the one on the top left there. It's got a connector for connecting to the host. It's got an antenna port. The one on the top right also has an antenna port, but you can see it doesn't really have a connector. It's more like soldered down pads. And then the one in the middle at the bottom there has also the soldered down pads, doesn't even have an antenna connector. With all three of these, the radio hardware is contained on the module. And if you supplied an input voltage to it, and you supplied a signal to and from it, and you used either the antenna connector or an RF pin to take the RF signal away from it, it is in fact radio equipment. What about these then? Are these radio modules? Well, it's probably not. When we talked about the FCC terminology in the last last month, we saw that the modules on the previous slide would have been certified as radio modules, but these ones probably would not. But radio module is an interesting international term, and we'll learn today whether there's really such a thing as a radio module when it comes to EU compliance. So the purpose of today's seminar then is for you to understand the general requirements. This is only going to be about 1 hour or maybe 1 hour and 15 minutes. It's impossible to cover such a big topic in all that time, so we're going to try and go over the basics with you. I want to help you avoid the most common mistakes that people make, speed up your time to market, which we acknowledged last week was the most critical thing, increase product quality. This is an important thing when you've got multiple radios, or if you've got a radio installed into a product that it wasn't originally assessed for. I want you to help reduce your risks of getting your product turned away at customs or removed from the market, and to help you understand the legal and technical responsibilities for compliance. So as I've just pointed out, really, this is part 4 of a 4-part webinar series. We did 2 webinars in June on the FCC and Canada overview of compliance and then radio modules. Last week, we did the Radio Equipment Directive and the UK's radio regulations overview of compliance. And now this week, we're looking at radio modules in Europe. All of the webinars, by the way, are available for catch up. And in fact, I think they're on YouTube. So let's have a quick recap of some of the things we learned last week. I don't want to go back over the whole webinar, but I want to pick out some things we learned which are really critical to today's module topic. So for the RED and the UK regulations, we learned that it's all about declaration of conformity, and we explained what that declaration of conformity is and the fact that it's actually a declaration document that applies to each individual unit that is placed on the market. It's not just an overall procedure that applies to a model number. And we explained that whole concept of placing on the market such that the idea of placing on the market applies to each individual unit. And we talked about the fact that there's one authorization per unit, or per equipment. So for example, if a product has multiple functions, in June, we learned that a product could have multiple authorizations. If you have a host equipment with 2 radio modules in it, for example, it could have one DOC for the host and it could have 2 certifications for the 2 modules. However, with EU and UK, we learned in the last week that we have one authorization, and it's a declaration of conformity by the end product manufacturer. And we talked about the testing and authorization requirements for the EU. We went over the technical documentation required, and we spoke quite a lot about the manufacturer's risk assessment, what it should contain and how important it is. And we talked about the notified body's type examination certificate and when that's necessary. We talked about the fact that the manufacturer must keep up with changes. So for example, you don't just authorize once for the EU, you authorize or assess your product to the Radio Equipment Directive, And then as you continue to place new units of your models on the market, if any changes take place, you must reassess to keep up with those changes, such that each new unit that comes off the production line and is placed on the market is compliant with the requirements at the time of that unit being placed on the market. And those changes could be changes to your own equipment, to the standards, to the regulations, or to the way people are using your products. We talked about harmonized standard and the presumption of conformity that they allow, and the fact that there's an official journal of harmonized standards in Europe and the UK designated standards in the UK. Right now, for the Radio Equipment Directive, those two lists are aligned, but we suspect that they will diverge at some point in the future, such as they have done already in the Low Voltage Directive. We talked about maintaining compliance of products that are already on the market and market surveillance. We also went through some of the major differences and similarities between the EU and UK requirements. Okay, so as I said, today we're going to start off by looking at the test and authorization requirements of the module itself. And what does the CE marked and UKCA marked module actually give us? And then the testing and technical responsibilities for an installer of that CE marked module and the legal authorization responsibilities of that company. As I said, this webinar will be probably just over an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, but we will allow plenty of time for questions. So this is a slide I often like to point out, and it's very important with the topic of radio modules. People often seem to think that testing and approvals is one common thing. They say, well, I'll get my product tested so that it's approved, or it's approved, so it therefore would pass the tests. But the reality is that testing is great, but it's only therefore approved if you followed the right procedures and the right processes and done the right testing. And approvals are all very well as long as you're using the product in the way it was intended. Otherwise, a product may look approved, but it would fail to pass the tests if it was not used in the correct way. So you can see then that there is a definite difference between the topics of testing and approvals. Sometimes a product may need testing, but no further approval. Sometimes a product may require additional approvals without any further testing. So a recap then about the EU and UK requirements is a declaration of conformity on a final radio equipment, and that's any equipment which contains radio, transmitters, receivers, or transceivers, with a frequency range of up to 3000 gigahertz. And this talks about devices which are placed on the market with that radio permanently installed. So, for example, in front of me, I have a laptop. Imagine the laptop was a very basic laptop that didn't have any radio feature in it whatsoever. Well, then that laptop would be covered by the EMC directive and the low voltage directive, not the radio equipment directive because it isn't radio. If I then took a wireless USB dongle, which was within the scope of the RER and had been assessed to the RER, and I plugged that USB dongle into the side of my laptop wouldn't suddenly become radio equipment. My laptop would still be a piece of electronic equipment, not radio, and it would be connected to a radio equipment in the way that the laptop manufacturer and the USB dongle manufacturer had anticipated. However, if the manufacturer of this laptop had taken a radio, maybe that same USB dongle, and they had installed it permanently inside the laptop before they placed the laptop on the market, then the laptop would be radio equipment. It would be covered by the Radio Equipment Directive, not the EMC Directive or Low Voltage Directive, and the laptop manufacturer would be responsible for every part of it. So as a reminder, the RER is a trade directive. It's not a technical document. It doesn't tell you which tests must be performed. It doesn't give you levels and limits, and it doesn't tell you how to perform the assessment. However, it does tell you that a technical assessment is required, and it stipulates what type of assessment must be performed. There's only one authorization route, It's declaration of conformity by the end equipment manufacturer. And there's certification. So there's no requirement to register or upload any sort of information about a transmitter to any kind of authority. So the technical assessment scope that I said is listed in the red. It states that a product safety assessment must be performed, EMC performance, radio performance, and some other categories in Article 3.3. Now, product safety includes all aspects of safety, including the reasonably unforeseen use or reasonably foreseen use. We're talking there about product safety, but also RF exposure. EMC performance, we're talking about emissions and immunity of all aspects of the radio, or all aspects of the product. And the radio performance, that's transmitter performance and receiver performance. And Article 3.3, those are those other categories that we talked about last week. There's not too much to say about those at the moment, but we do expect them to be enacted pretty soon. So the declaration of conformity then. There's one declaration of conformity that covers all aspects of the product to the Radio Equipment Directive. So the good example that most people use is a washing machine with Bluetooth. So let's say you permanently install a Bluetooth module inside a washing machine. There'll be one declaration of conformity to the Radio Equipment Directive and any other applicable directives on that for that equipment. And the compliance declaration to the Radio Equipment Directive will cover the radio part and the washing machine part, not just the radio part. Similarly, if you have a multimedia device, the declaration of conformity covers all aspects of it, product safety as a multimedia device and as a radio, EMC as multimedia and as a radio. And the DOC is the responsibility of the final manufacturer, who takes all the responsibility. So, as you may remember from last week, the safety, EMC, radio, and other parts of the assessment must all be performed on the product, and any other assessments for any other directives would lead down to the compliance of that directive, and then there would be one declaration of conformity. Now, it's important to note that I did say assessment rather than testing. As we talked about last week, there's nothing that states you must test. There's an essential requirement to assess the product for safety, EMC, and radio. The most common solution is to use the published standards, and then that is the preferred approach. So using test standards to demonstrate compliance with the directive. But you're assessing to the standard, and we can come on to that in a little bit later. If there are any changes to the device, then it needs to be reassessed. Or if there's any changes to the standard or the way you see your product being used, then you'll need to reassess it. And that doesn't always mean a full retest. It can just be an assessment by the manufacturer to ensure that the final product is compliant with the latest standard, and ideally the harmonized standards. So as a reminder then, there is no certification. It's always DOC, even in cases when the notified body has issued an EU type examination certificate. And if there are multiple radios in one product, then the manufacturer is responsible for assessing that. And each radio will probably have been assessed to an individual standard, and that standard will have been written only with that technology type in mind. And so it's the manufacturer of the final product's responsibility to assess each individual radio, but also to assess the interaction between all those radios. And that applies whether you design a product with multiple radios in it, or you make a product and then install multiple modules. Okay then, radio modules. So we're looking at life now from the point of view of the radio module manufacturer, and what a CE marked radio module or UKCA marked module actually means. Now, back in June, when we talked about the FCC and Canadian requirements, we talked about modular approval. And that's because in the USA and Canada, it's a certification authorization scheme, such that a radio must be tested, sure, and then certified such that all the information of the transmitter is provided and uploaded to the FCC and Canada. It's a certification process to register that product, if you like, with the authorities. And if you were to install a radio certified into some other product, then effectively the certification is void, unless the radio had a special type of certification known as modular approval. And the modular approval gave it a kind of superpower such that it could keep its certification even when it was installed inside some other host. So, do we have an equivalent to that in the EU? Well, the clue, of course, is in the fact that we don't have any certification, and we have a declaration of conformity for each new unit by the end equipment manufacturer. So, there really is no such thing as a modular approval in the EU. We don't have an equivalent system. Radio modules are not mentioned anywhere in the RED, and there's nothing special about them with regard to RED compliance. They're either radio equipment or they're not. Certification is not a compliance route for the RED, so of course, if there's no certification of a module, there's nothing to be carried over into a host. There's a CE marking and a declaration of conformity of a module, but that's the compliance of the module assessed in the way it was tested by the module manufacturer. So radio equipment is placed on the market in the EU based on the DOC. So a radio module in the EU sense is basically radio equipment, and it should comply with the RED if it meets the definition of radio equipment. So if all the radio hardware is contained within it and it can operate as radio equipment, then it meets the definition of the RED, of radio equipment in the RED. This has been discussed quite a lot in the appropriate committees with the European Commission and Market Surveillance Authority, and they've made it very clear that if a radio module manufacturer wishes to place that radio module on the market to sell it or to give it away, then it must be CE marked and compliant with the RED. Even if it's a business-to-business contract where they're selling the modules to another company, specifically for that company to place the product on the market, that business-to-business transaction is still considered placing it on the market. You may remember that this is very different to the USA and Canada approach, where in the USA and Canada, you could choose to certify the module to help perhaps make life easier for the installer, or you could choose to sell it as a component and leave the certification part to the installer. In the EU, we don't have that option. So a radio module is therefore CE marked as radio equipment if you want to place that module on the market in the EU. The radio module would need to be UKCA marked if you wanted to place that module on the market in the UK or Great Britain. Of course, if you were making a module in, let's say, China, and you wanted to sell it to a company in the USA, of course, it wouldn't need to be CE marked because it's not being placed on the market in the EU at that point. So for a radio module manufacturer then, they've got to perform some testing. It's radio equipment and it's going to need testing, or should I say assessment, for product safety, EMC performance, radio performance, and the other categories. You can't just say, well, it's a special type of radio and therefore I'm not going to do one of them. There have been radio module manufacturers who've said, well, I know for a fact that, or I know for certainty that the installer is bound to do product safety, so I'm not going to bother. Or, well, I know that the installer is bound to do EMC performance testing, so there's no need for me to do that. Well, that's not correct. If the module manufacturer wishes to place their product on the market, they need to assess it for safety, EMC, and radio performance. So the radio module is going to be assessed for its intended environment. And actually, the interpretation of that may vary from module manufacturers. Obviously, I just mentioned on the previous slide that that some manufacturers of modules simply have been known to miss out whole sections of the requirements, and there's no way of knowing that really if you buy a CE marked module. But even beyond that, the module is typically assessed on a test jig. And some module manufacturers may say, right, well, we're going to assess it for automotive environments or really extreme temperatures, or we're going to put long cables on the test jigs and really assess it for a wide range of installations. Whereas other module manufacturers would say, well, look, actually, all we really need to do here is do a basic assessment for it sitting on a test jig, because that's all we can really know. So there can be some variety in the way the module is assessed, but the instructions from the to the installer from the module manufacturer should be pretty clear. Most radio modules, in fact, are tested sitting on a test jig, and therefore they are CE marked for their intended environment, which is sitting on a test jig. And effectively nothing else has been covered at that point. This is a tricky situation for module manufacturers because the requirements say that the radio equipment manufacturer must assess their radio for its intended environment. But of course, they're also being told you must CE mark it. But then we also know that they don't know what the intended environment is. This is tricky for module manufacturers, and the result is that they'll normally test it on a test jig or at the end of a length of cable as a standalone module, and that will allow them to CE mark it and place that module on the market. What that means to the installer, of course, is that effectively it's CE marked for exactly that condition, sitting on a test jig or on the end of a cable. So testing the radio module, radio performance tests actually not too difficult. If a radio module has an antenna connector or an antenna RF pin, then a lot of the radio testing can be performed as a conducted RF measurement. And often a typical antenna will be added for any sort of radio testing. But a lot of the testing can be done as a conducted measurement out of the antenna port. EMC is a little bit more complicated. The radiated immunity testing, for example, would typically need to be done with an antenna connected, so a typical antenna would be used. ESD, you're not going to want to hit a delicate little module with an ESD gun, and so typically people will do the vertical coupling plane and horizontal coupling plane around the module. But then a lot of the other EMC tests are simply not performed if the manufacturer states that the test jig has short cables, for example. Product safety should be fully assessed for the module. Really, the most critical things are breaking down of voltages and temperature range, things like that. RF exposure, pretty difficult to do a SAR test on a module when you don't know where it's going to be installed. So mostly people are going to assess it for compliance at a sort of comfortable 20 centimeter distance. So the authorization then of the radio module. Well, the radio module must of course come with its own declaration of conformity. All radio equipment must come with a declaration of conformity, and the DOC must state all accessories. When they say all accessories, they really mean any accessory that the user could change which could affect compliance. So if the module has an integral built-in antenna, that antenna doesn't need to be listed on the DOC because it's not something anyone could change. However, if they have an antenna connector and the user could have a range of antennas, then they should be stating which accessories are permitted based on the way they assess their module. Similarly with software or firmware, if the installer has no way to change that or it couldn't affect the compliance anyway, then it doesn't need to be listed on the DOC or the user manual. But if the installer could affect the firmware or software, maybe it can allow them to change channels or output powers, then the firmware versions should be listed. The instructions to the installer should be very clear. The FCC have pretty strict rules on the instructions that should go from a module manufacturer to the installer. And for example, that should be telling the installer, please be aware, you're going to need to retest the radio tests. There's no such equivalent in the EU, of course, but you are expected to give instructions to your customer that they will be using the radio in a compliant way. So the instructions should be clear to the installer of how to keep their module compliant. And that's particularly important for things like a module that has an RF pin and perhaps the antenna trace layout is on the host. There are no rules on module quality or design. With the FCC, we learnt that the module itself, the transmitter section, must have a shield so that signals from the module can't couple onto the host, but that also that signals from the host can't couple onto the module and affect the module performance. And we learnt that a module must have a voltage regulator so that no matter what voltage you test it with, a different voltage from the host shouldn't affect the radio performance. Well, there isn't such rules in the EU because, of course, we don't have modular approvals. And so it's really important then for the module installer to identify that they are using the module in the way it was assessed. Okay, so to come back to this picture then, well, are these radio modules? Well, yeah, in the common terminology that we use, of course, they're radio modules, but in the sense of the Radio Equipment Directive, they're just radio equipment, just like any other. In fact, just like these, they're radio equipment. Okay, so now then, let's look at installing one of those authorized radio modules. Thankfully, this picture isn't to scale because otherwise they'd be pretty tricky to get that big module into those tiny little products. But here's an example of some products that might have radio modules in them. So we're going to look now at the requirements for a radio module installation as viewing life through the eyes of the company who acquires the CE marked or UKCA marked module and is installing it for use in their final equipment. And what authorization is required on the final equipment? Well, here's a slide that I had as a teaser slide at the end of last week's presentation, and I've changed it a little bit. I've added the words radio module instead of radio equipment on the left-hand circle. So if you have a radio module that the module manufacturer has CE marked to place on the market, and then some other company has a host or other equipment which also requires CE marking, and the radio module is placed inside the other equipment, then you end up with a final radio equipment, which must be CE marked. As we know, the famous statement, CE plus CE does not equal CE. So if you put a module into another host, you end up with a final product, a new equipment. Its manufacturer is probably the host manufacturer, but they've changed their product by making it radio equipment within scope of the RER. So with regard to the installer of the CE marked radio module, the manufacturer of the new product becomes responsible for the radio compliance of their product. The final product must be fully assessed to all the aspects of the RER. And the installer of the radio module becomes the final product manufacturer because their name is on the final product. The name of the module manufacturer, of course, doesn't appear on the end product, and the CE mark is not exactly transferable, so of course all the responsibility is on the end installer. So we look again here, product safety, EMC performance, radio, and Article 3.3. So the final radio product then must be assessed to all these parts. Now, I say assessed and I don't say testing because it might be that you want to fully test everything and just get it out of the way, or it might be that you take some results from the radio module and some new results of your final radio product and merge them together such that you have assessed your end product to the final requirements. And now, as we said, the most common way of assessing a product to the Radio Equipment Directive is to apply a test standard, an EN standard written by ETSI or Senelec. So to apply that standard, you need to go through and have some sort of evidence or justification for compliance with all the different parts, but doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a test of the final product. So let's go through those, each one's in detail. So product safety first. So you've installed a CE marked radio module into your product. Of course, you're going to do product safety on the end product. The product safety of assessment for the module isn't really going to be relevant to the end product, other than, of course, the fact that you're going to want to check that the module is at least safe for use over the temperature range where it will be in your product, and sort of the safety voltage requirements of where it's going to be placed. RF exposure, however, if it's a device for use for more than 20 centimeters from the person and RF exposure is based on a calculation, then you might decide to just accept the calculation from the module as being relevant to your product, because if the antenna gain is the same and the power is the same and the use case is the same, then you haven't really changed anything. But if your product is more than 20 milliwatts power and used within 20 centimeters of the body, then a SAR test is going to be needed. And therefore, that's a fully dependent on the end product assessment. EMC. Well, really, the EMC test is going to be based on the end product. So EMC assessment at the final radio equipment level, and EMC is typically tested on the final equipment. The product is probably going to have its own functions, whether it's multimedia or appliance or whatever. It's going to have its own functions, and those parts are going to be tested for EMC. But the radio performance link, the ability for the radio to continue to communicate or not accidentally communicate during the EMC immunity testing, is an important requirement. And although the module manufacturer will have performed those tests of the module on the jig, the installer also needs to be confident and assess their product to those requirements. If your module is literally sitting on a test jig or a board, just as the original module did, the module manufacturer's assessment, then maybe you could conclude that some of their results are applicable to you, but that's pretty rare. In most cases, the final radio equipment manufacturer is going to end up fully retesting EMC immunity of their product, including the assessment of the radio link. And typically that's while it's transmitting, making sure it's still doing what it should do, and also while it's not operating, to make sure it doesn't suddenly start transmitting. Radio performance then. Okay, so safety and EMC, we've established that really you're going to start testing from fresh. But radio performance, this is the case where you can start to use more test results from the radio module manufacturer. Of course, the assessment is at the final radio equipment level, but the manufacturer of the final radio equipment on a case-by-case basis may choose that some of the tests are not needed. Anything that could be affected by the installation of the module should be retested, and anything that is not affected by the installation of the module, the manufacturer could choose to accept from the module's results. Now, what do I really mean by that? Well, most people will repeat any testing that's based on a radiated measurement, because if your module is sitting on a test jig, then of course you could argue that the radiated transmitter spurious emissions is going to be exactly as it was when the module was tested, and therefore not needed. But in most cases, the module is inside a host, there's an enclosure case, there are other pieces of metal work, then of course the transmitter spurious emissions could be changed. And if you change anything like the antenna or the antenna path from the module to the antenna, then any of those radiated test cases would need to be repeated. Typically, most people will repeat the transmitter radiated spurious emissions. Most people will recheck the EIRP or radiated power. And one thing that a lot of people forget to test, but should think a little bit more about, is the receiver performance. Receiver performance is covered in every ETSI radio standard these days, and when people install a radio module into their host, you often hear people say, I'm pretty confident the spurious emissions will pass because the enclosure of my host is bound to provide some sort of shielding. Well, if that's the case, then it's also going to provide shielding that stops signals getting to your receiver of your module, and therefore the receiver performance of your final product may not be as good as the receiver performance of the module was. And you, when you sell your product, are declaring that your final product has good receiver performance and would comply with the standards. So you need to consider any tests which could be affected by the installation. If we use Bluetooth as an example, people would often say, right, well, all those tests like how often does it hop, how long does it spend on each channel, how many channels does it hop over, and what's the spacing between those channels. Of course, I'm not going to bother retesting those because I haven't changed any of those things. But yes, transmitter spurious emissions, EIRP, and the ability to receive correctly, receiver blocking, those are the tests that can often be affected by the installation. And of course, any of those Article 3.3 categories, when they become enabled, will be assessed at the module level, but then the installer will also need to assess that it's still compliant. So it might be a bit confusing for you if you've been sitting there with a pen in your hand and a piece of paper on your desk thinking, right, this is good. Michael's going to tell me exactly which tests I must perform when I install a CE marked radio module. So I'm going to write them down and then I will know exactly which tests I must perform. And you're sitting there right now looking at a blank piece of paper thinking, well, he didn't really tell me what I must test. And he didn't tell me which tests I don't have to do. And that's correct. There isn't a test that you must do, and there aren't any tests that you do not have to do. It's the installer's responsibility. Most people test transmitter radiated spurious emissions, and that is a good idea. A lot of people check output power EIRP, and again, very good idea. Fewer people, but still good, check the basic receiver sensitivity is okay. And then all the things like the timing and the bandwidth and the kind of duty cycle type of tests people don't do. Those are the most common things. However, it would be wrong of me to sit here and say you must test transmitter spurious emissions, because if your product is a circuit board the same size as the test jig the module was tested on, and your enclosure is plastic or it doesn't have an enclosure and there's no extra metal work around it and you haven't changed the antenna, then your assessment might conclude that the transmitter spurious emissions from the module is applicable to your end installation. However, if you feel like your installation has affected the spurious emissions quite badly and the receiver performance, and you've got other things, other noise going on in your product which could have affected the way it operates, then it's your responsibility to go and check those things. So there is no full list. The manufacturer really needs to take ownership of this. It's very interesting because test labs desperately competing with each other to try and provide a good service, and people often think that test labs are trying to sell as much testing as possible, whereas in fact we've reached a point where test labs are trying to have a cheap quote as possible, and so they're often trying to find the smallest amount of testing that will make you happy. It shouldn't really be about making you happy. It should be about you telling the test lab exactly which tests you think need doing. Of course, you can ask the test lab for advice if you don't think you understand the situation, and you can say, we've installed this module, which testing do you think we should do? But it's important for the manufacturer to take responsibility, and it's important for the test lab not to just blindly say, do this test, don't do anything else, you'll be fine. The test lab can easily give advice, and we often do, and all of the test labs do, but the manufacturer has the ultimate decision because you are the ones signing your declaration. And you can't say, no, we didn't do those tests because we don't have to, because of course there is no such thing as not having to do those tests if they've changed. So I've noticed manufacturers take differing approaches to solve this. You'll see the title of this slide is Testing Approach, Business Approach. So some manufacturers, they'll install a module or maybe multiple modules, and they'll think to themselves, okay, these modules have been fully tested. I want to do the absolute minimum amount of testing on my end product because I don't like going to the test lab and I want to reduce my time there. And my boss is looking very closely at my testing budget, but he's not looking very closely at my own salary or consultant budget. So some companies will get a compliance consultant, or they'll have a compliance manager, or they'll ask somebody like myself to review the test reports of the radio modules and find the worst case channels, the worst case modulations, the worst case mode, and suggest a first approach of testing. And then they'll do that first approach of testing and get in the lab, and then they'll come out and they'll look at the results, and then maybe they'll say, do you know what? It's passing really well. We're happy. Let's stop testing. Or they might say, oh, that's worse than we expected. Let's get back in the lab now. So we call up the lab. We need to come back in tomorrow and carry on with testing because the results didn't look good. By doing it this way, of course, you need a lot of expertise involved, and it could take a long time, but you will minimize your testing and you'll end up doing the absolute minimum amount of testing. The other approach I see people make is just giving the final product to the test lab and saying, look, just test it. Test all of these things, please, because we haven't got time to go through the modules reports. We're really risk averse. We don't want to take the risk that we've made a bad decision. We haven't got a compliance expert who's going to look after it. And we know that your lead time is 3 months. So if we take our product away, realize we need more testing, we can't come straight back in. So some people will want to try and work with their results to minimize their testing. Others won't want to think about it. They'll just throw it in and do more testing. It's a critical thing with regard to time to market, and each company will have their own decision of how they do that. You do need to think about the fact that you need a compliant final product. If I go back to the first 2 boxes of this slide, actually a lot of manufacturers will say, oh, no, what I really want is minimum amount of testing and no brainwork activity and the fastest time to market. But often we're looking there at the classic quality time cost triangle where you can't have it all. If you have multiple radios in one device, as we had with this slide before, as a reminder, if you start putting multiple radios into a device, if you've decided that, okay, I'm going to just repeat transmitter spurious emissions, I'm going to put my radios in there, you need to start thinking about the combination of those radios. Intermodulation products occur if you've got them all transmitting, so you need to think about which combination of channels you might test. But also, if you've already made the decision, I'm not going to bother retesting the receiver performance, it'll be fine. Well, you've got to think about what kind of environment you're putting that radio module into. If it's got a lot of noise around the receiver frequency, that's important to know. If you've got a transmitter operating around the kind of 4G band, 700 to 850 megahertz band, and you've got a GPS and you've got Wi-Fi, well, that 700 to 800 megahertz transmitter, its second harmonic is going to be in the GPS receiver band, and its third harmonic is going to be in the Wi-Fi receiver band. So you've got to think a little bit about not just tell me which test I must do, but more looking at your product and thinking which test is applicable for my product. Becomes even more tricky, as I say, when combining multiple modules. The noisy environment affects the receiver performance. Therefore, there are fewer tests you can trust from the modules report, and you're going to get interference between the different transmitters. So if the 2 transmitters or 3 transmitters are operating and intermodulation signals appear, they could appear in the receiver channels. Performing these tests then is why I said it can also help improve the quality of the radio. This is about as complex as radio compliance gets. It's a funny thing that often you have manufacturers who design and build really quite complex radio devices, but it's just got one transmitter or one radio in it, a microwave fixed link maybe, or a cellular base station. This is a complicated radio, but it's really just one radio type, and it's tested to a harmonized standard, and it's a declaration of conformity by the manufacturer who made everything in that product. People think of that as being complex, but actually, really, from a test and approvals point of view, it's really quite simple. Meanwhile, we've got people trying to put out really, cool looking, faster market, multimedia, home play, home automation, and they want to put in an LTE module from one company, a GPS module from another company, and a short range device LoRa from another company, squeeze them all together. You've got test results from 3 different module manufacturers, which maybe they'll give you, maybe they won't. You've got some test results of your own. It's actually very complicated. It's about as complicated as it gets in testing and compliance terms. Testing, it's complicated because you've got multiple radios and you're trying to take some results from other places. The authorization route, in theory, is simple because it's just one DOC by the end product manufacturer. You're not accepting the DOCs of the other modules, but you're still trying to reference compliance with standards that are maybe harmonized at the time the module was placed on the market, based on how the time at which you're selling your product. The manufacturer's risk assessment then, which is a document we talked about last week, becomes very complicated when you start installing radio modules. And the fewer tests you do on the end product, the longer your risk assessment is going to become. So one thing I often do, and I'm not trying to plug my own services here, I'm just trying to tell you how much fun I have doing these things. People will often come along and say, I've got this product, multimedia, maybe it goes in a vehicle or it does these things. I've installed 3 different radio modules. I want to now sell it to the USA, Canada, and the EU. What do I do? As I said, that isn't a simple, here are the answers right here. It can take a long time to really evaluate all of the results from all of the different radios, calculate exactly which tests we would recommend you perform, which tests we would recommend you could avoid doing, and what your final compliance route is. So it's quite a complicated process if you want to go down that route. Good fun though. So the technical documentation of the final radio product. If the final radio product manufacturer has evidence that they have fully applied the harmonized standards, then they have presumption of conformity. It doesn't mean you have to have a full, pretty test report for your end product. If we use the example of the Bluetooth, if you've got the Bluetooth modules test report, and you've decided to accept that all of those conducted antenna port tests, the hopping rate, the number of hopping channels, the time at which it spends on each channel, if you've decided that you haven't changed any of those things, and you've repeated the transmitter spurious emissions tests and the EIRP output power test, and maybe the module was placed on the market 6 months ago to the older Bluetooth harmonized standard, and you're planning to place yours on the market from August, so you need to apply the newer harmonized standard, so you're going to have to repeat the blocking test anyway. Well, suddenly then, with this jigsaw or patchwork, you can conclude that you have evidence that you have fully applied the harmonized standard, and therefore you have presumption of conformity. If you don't have presumption of conformity, or if the standard you're using isn't harmonized, then remember you will need a notified bodies type examination certificate. Actually, a lot of people do ask for the notified body certificate when installing modules anyway, just to get some extra confidence. The technical documentation of the end product must include all aspects of it, and that includes the radio, because you are fully responsible for that radio now. Ideally, the test results of the radio would be part of the technical documentation, but also the technical details of the module. Now, it's quite likely that the module manufacturer isn't going to want to give you their schematics and their parts lists and their block diagrams. And okay, you might decide that you're not going to push them on that, they won't give it to you, but if market surveillance asks you for that information, you need to know that the module manufacturer would provide it to market surveillance on your behalf. So, any acceptance of test data from the module is at the decision of the installer. Everything should be included in the risk assessment of the final product. So if you forget any test results of the module and you fully test your end product to look harmonized or the published standards, then okay, that's pretty simple. But if you start deciding that there's some of the tests you're not going to perform, then you need to document that decision in your risk assessment. The manufacturer of the final radio product is the one that signs the DOC. So the DOC of the final radio product will list the radio standards that you are applying to the RED. Now, it might be that you've referenced them from the DOC of the module. You've looked at the DOC of the module and said, well, the module was compliant to those standards. I'm repeating some basic radiated tests, and therefore I'm concluding that my product also meets that same standard. But you've got to think about which standard is applicable at the time you sell your product. And your product will be declared to the RED, and you have to list those standards you applied. Any changes to the module must be assessed. Now, this is important. If you're selling a piece of radio equipment, as we said before in this webinar and last week, as the compliance manager, if you're selling radio equipment and your engineering team makes a change to your radio equipment, you need to be on top of that. You need to be knowing whether you need to go to the lab for a bit of a retest, or maybe you just document it in your risk assessment. Well, in the same way, if you're buying in a radio module and you've chosen to accept some of the results from the module as being valid for your product, you need to know if the module has changed. So that's a communication setup that you should try and have with the module manufacturer. Check that the versions of the standards have not changed. So again, you're selling a radio equipment now, and if the standards change, you need to be on top of that. More importantly, if the radio module was placed on the market at a certain time, it would have been placed on the market based on the standards at that time. By the time you've bought the modules, developed your product, installed the modules, your product needs to be compliant with the standard that's applicable and harmonized at that point. So you need to keep up to date with those changing standards. And then with regard to the notified bodies EU type examination certificate, the notified body certificate may be necessary if the radio has been assessed to a non-harmonized standard. So, for example, if the radio standard is non-harmonized, then the radio module manufacturer will have needed a type examination certificate before they could CE mark their radio module. Then, when the manufacturer of the end product installs that module, they have a new product, they wish to sell their product, well, the standard is still not harmonized, so they will need a notified body certificate to sell their product with a non-harmonized standard. And the type examination certificate from the module is not transferable to the end product, of course, because the notified body reviewed a standard, a module in one case. And then in the second case, you're asking them to review a completely different product, which is the end product. And the final radio equipment, of course, would have been placed on the market at a different time as well, and would need to be meeting the standards of that time. Now, there is some guidance on the topic, and this is a complicated topic which is still a little bit up in the air, to be honest. The standards and the regulations are written from a really simplistic point of view. So let's say, for example, you have a non-radio product where the EMC directive applies. There'll be an EMC emission standard and an EMC immunity standard. That's pretty clear. Now you look at radio equipment. The radio standards and the EMC standards were not really written with thinking about each other. So the radio performance standard has a transmitter emissions limit, which is quite high, and a receiver emissions limit, which is much tighter. And the requirement for that emissions limit to be strict is so that the noise from the product does not interfere with its own receiver. If you start combining products together, however, you have a situation where the radio standard says that all of the other operations of the product should comply with the receiver performance emissions or the transmitter performance emissions, depending on which mode it has. So if it's a transmitter or a transceiver, then the transmitter spurious emissions limit applies. Then suddenly the other operations have got quite a relaxed spurious emissions limit. But if it's a receiver or has a receive-only mode, then the whole product has to meet really quite a strict limit. Well, in reality, what people do is they'll apply the radio performance limits to the radio part and the EMC product standard requirements to the other part. Now, this is kind of in contradiction to the origin of the receiver emissions limits, because now you've got potentially noisy product with a radio receiver in it. People get around that by documenting it in their risk assessment, but it's a topic that's up in the air for debate at the moment. But right now there is some guidance. There's EN 303-446, and for example, it does state that when you've got a combination of radio and non-radio in one product, the non-radio functions can be assessed to the EMC product standard. So therefore, you do end up assessing the radio performance, radiated emissions, for example, and the product emissions separately. Ideally, they would all meet the radio emissions limits. And also, of course, you have a situation with the EMC immunity testing, where perhaps being a radio equipment, the frequency range of the testing would be wider, such as radiated immunity testing from 80 megahertz to 6 gigahertz, whereas the EMC standard may not have called for that. Meanwhile, the EMC standard, maybe it's from a medical environment or an industrial environment, which would have much higher levels, such as 10 volts per meter. So in reality then, with your combined product, you're going to end up doing a wide frequency range and a high immunity level. As I say, this all needs to be documented in the risk assessment, and it is a topic in progress with regard to the application of the spurious emissions limits. Sometimes you have multiple directives that apply, not just multiple standards and multiple modes of operation. So for example, if you had a medical device where the EMC standard would be the medical standard, and you're also considering the EMC of the radio link, you're thinking of the end environment. So in this example here, you'd use the higher ESD levels because, of course, it's a radio performance, but in a medical environment. So if you've got multiple modes and operations or multiple directives, you really need to be thinking about a test plan. And you need to be thinking about not just, oh, this is the radio standard, it says 3 volts per meter, but more like, okay, I've got a radio equipment, but where am I selling it into? What environment is it going to be used in? And maybe it's going to need a harsher test. And discuss the test plan with test labs and notified bodies. I usually try and avoid listing standard names because it's not very exciting, but I try to give a few examples in these slides. There's a group called the Red CA. They're the notified body group for the RED, and they have TGN01, which is all about radio modules and the installation of radio modules. There's also TGN31, which deals with any radio equipment that has multiple radios within it. There's an ETSI guide that should say EG 203367. And then there's these two standards, EN 303446. There's -1 for domestic or commercial environments and -2 for industrial. They're useful documents, but they're not harmonized standards. So really they're guidance. And with regard to using non-harmonized standards, of course, anytime you use a non-harmonized standard, that's something else which must be in your risk assessment, which, as we concluded last week, is the first document you open and the last document you close on your compliance journey. So you may remember this slide we had last week, where your products may start in a factory and then they may go to a shop in the EU, and then they may end up with the user. And let's say, for example, you've got 1,000 of them with the user, 1,000 of them in the shops, and 1,000 of them in the factory. And then suddenly the standard changes, or the way people use the product changes. The ones with the user or on the shops, they're already on the market and do not need to be recalled. But the ones in the factory are not on the market yet and must meet the latest requirements. Now, it's important to remember that the module manufacturer has to go through this process, and so do you. So you could have a situation where the module left the factory, was in the shops, effectively online available, and then ended up with the user, and that's you. So from the module manufacturer's point of view, they are on the market and then they are gone. Now you buy those products and you begin to integrate those modules into your own product. Your product starts back at the factory stage now, and if the standard changes then when your product hits the market, it needs to meet a different standard to the one that was applicable when the module was placed on the market. If market surveillance finds non-compliant products, if they find a non-compliant radio module, they'll go after the module manufacturer. And if they find a non-compliant end product, they'll go after the end product manufacturer. They won't be interested in the module manufacturer. Okay, so what complications do we have due to Brexit and the UK leaving the EU? Well, firstly, from the module manufacturer's point of view, the module will be assessed to the same standards, the EN standards. However, they'll be striving to keep up with the latest harmonized standards. Now in the EU, then we have the official journal of harmonized standards, and in the UK, we have the UK designated standards. At the moment, they're aligned, but we suspect there'll easily be times when they're not aligned. The installer then, when they've got those modules, they've installed them into their own products, when they sell their product, they'll need to be applying the latest harmonized standards for the EU and designated standards for the UK. So again, it's just another set of documentation for both of those companies to keep track of. Now, this is an interesting point, and I hopefully everybody understands this. Because we've accepted in this webinar today, hopefully you all understand that the fact that the module has a CE mark isn't really legally useful to the installer. It's the real importance of it is to allow the module manufacturer to sell it. It's a good way of the module manufacturer letting the installer know that their module is compliant, but really it's all about the test results are the most important things. So if you're a manufacturer outside the EU and UK, so let's say you're in the USA and you buy a radio module from the USA or from China, it doesn't need to be CE marked or UKCA marked. But if it's been tested, that would be very useful, and you could install the module, you could use the results from the module manufacturer, because you are then CE marking your final product and UKCA marking your final product. Well, now think about a manufacturer who's in the EU and they buy a CE marked radio module and they install it in, and now they're going to CE mark their end product based on some results from the module and some results of retesting, so they will CE mark their end product. They'll also UKCA mark their end product if they want to sell into Britain. It won't matter that the module wasn't UKCA marked. Or if you've got a UK-based manufacturer who's bought a UKCA marked module and they assess their product for the red and the UK market, and then they CE mark and UKCA mark their end product, it won't matter that the module didn't have a CE mark, because of course it's not a transferable mark. Okay, so some final comments then. Whenever I'm talking about installation of radio modules and how it's really not that simple, it often sounds that I'm being quite negative about the whole industry, but I'm really not. Authorized modules are a great thing and they are an excellent solution. They are the way in which we have so many radio-enabled devices put out there by companies who are, quite frankly, not radio experts. I know we have some module manufacturers on this call, and I've worked with a lot of module manufacturers over the years, and these are good quality products in most cases. Final product authorizations must be in place regardless of what's gone before, and the final product must meet the requirements. Again, the final company takes the responsibility. The CE mark is essential for the module manufacturer to place their module on the market in the EU, and the module manufacturer may not know the end installation. So the results of the module, the test results from the module, are kind of important to the module manufacturer because it allows them to CE mark it, but really they just want to know if it passes or fails so they can CE mark, because they don't know where it's going to end up. And they know, of course, that you're going to have to retest. The module's test results can be very important to the installer because they could influence how much retesting you perform. But the actual CE mark or UKCA mark of the module isn't so important to the installer because it's not a transferable thing. You're going to have to CE mark and UKCA mark your own product anyway. Some common mistakes then. Consistency of information. Often products come to me as a notified body or UK approved body for a review where somebody has installed a radio module and they've said, we only did this test because it was the worst case. Well, then when you look at the results from the radio module, you realize it wasn't the worst case at all. It maybe made a guess, or the statements from the final installer don't match what the module originally did, and nothing seems to align. Not understanding the basic concepts. Sometimes I'm asked to review a final product, let's say a multimedia device with a module installed, and the declaration of conformity will state that it complies with the RER and the EMC directive and the low voltage directive. Well, of course, then I know that they don't understand the fact that only the RER applies to their product, not the EMC directive and low voltage directive, but the EMC and safety testing does apply. And of course, knowing that the radio standards must be on their DOC and that it's not a simple modular approval process. Not testing, of course, is another common mistake. People just wanting to know which test must I do, which tests don't I have to do, without realizing that it can be a case-by-case basis. And as I said, guessing what the worst case. Sometimes it's multiple models and saying, well, we'll only test one, or sometimes it's saying we'll install a module, we'll do just the transmitter spurious emissions test, and we'll just test this mode because it's probably worst case, without ever investigating which is the worst case or looking at the module's test report. Lack of communication between the module manufacturer and the installer and the notified body, and people being unaware, the installer being unaware of the responsibilities on them. Wrong company, wrong role. So again, this is a case of often the installer not understanding their responsibilities or just wanting somebody else, probably the test lab, to just tell me what I must do, but I don't want to pay you to tell me what I must do. I just want you to tell me very quickly, and then I don't want to worry about it. Well, actually, it's not that simple. The lab desperate to get the job, might just say, yeah, we'll do this test for you. And then everyone appears to be happy, but in reality, the module manufacturer is fully responsible for that decision. Thinking it simple. This really is about as complicated as it gets from a compliance point of view. Mixing types of devices together, often radio into typically non-radio devices, perhaps from an environment, medical or automotive or home or industrial, that was never considered by all of the companies originally. And misinformation, this concept of, yeah, put the CE marked module in and it's okay. There's a lot of mistakes out there. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me yet again. This was number 4 in the 4-part webinar, but all 4 of these are available for watching on catch up. Next time you fancy a Netflix binge, why not watch these instead? And over the next year or so, we do plan some exciting new training, radio into new environments such as medical and automotive and industrial, but also compliance with different requirements. We will repeat our UKCA training, global market access, and industry such as conformance and industry certifications. We plan to do some webinars and some seminars. Okay, well, thank you very much. As again, my name was Michael. Thank you very much for listening to me. If there are any questions, I will now hand back to Laura and we will go through to see if there are any questions.
Hi there, Michael. It looks like we've had questions come in on the side there. So if you're okay to go through some of those and
yeah, absolutely, no problem at all. I've got 2 different screens of questions here, so it might look like I'm watching a game of tennis for the moment here. So thank you everybody for listening. Hopefully you found something useful there. So I will go through some of the questions received. One of the obvious questions that people keep asking is, will you get a recording of this webinar? And yes, you will. So first question, can we use an RF module that has not been assessed against the RED if we are incorporating it into equipment which will be assessed against the RED? Yeah, of course you can. If the module is assessed to the RED and CE marked to the RED, that allows the module manufacturer to sell it in the EU, and it gives the buyer some confidence that the module will pass all those tests, at least when it's on its own. No guarantee that it would pass the tests when it's installed in your product, of course. But if you've got a module that isn't been assessed to the RED, then that's no problem. It just means maybe if there are no tests done on it yet, you're going to have to just test everything. But if they give you the test results that they've got, then you might still choose to accept them. But the CE mark isn't a transferable mark. So the fact that the module isn't authorized with the CE mark doesn't make any difference to you as the final equipment manufacturer. Okay. Next one. If the module supplier refuses to provide the test reports and only provides a supporting declaration of conformity or even a certificate of conformity from an accredited lab, what action is recommended? Yeah, now this is quite common and it's quite a difficult thing. So you've got the radio module. As the end product manufacturer, you need to have confidence and evidence that your final product meets the essential requirements of the RED. And we've got these harmonized or not harmonized test standards, but we've got these ETSI and Senelec test standards. So let's look at if we assume that you're going to fully test safety and EMC, because that's what everybody does, I think we're talking here about the radio test report. And let's say you want to trust some of the radio tests, but the module manufacturer hasn't given you their test reports. The very simple question I would ask you is, well, then how are you going to have evidence that your end product complies if you don't retest those things? So if the module manufacturer will give you their test reports, then great, you've got it. if the module manufacturer can give you a notified body's EU type examination certificate of their module, then you've got evidence that an independent body reviewed their module, including their test results, to the RED. Not just to the test standard, but to the RED itself, and obviously checked to the standard. So as a manufacturer, I think, in my opinion, you could be very safe and comfortable if the module had a type examination certificate. You could have confidence that an independent body had reviewed the results and it was all okay. But the DOC is just a statement by the manufacturer to say, I think we passed. And giving you the DOC without the test results is like saying, trust us, we pass. We're not going to show you, but trust us, we do. And a certificate of conformity from a test lab is basically just, doesn't really mean anything. It's usually just a document which says they tested and they passed. But then the test report says that also. You sometimes see test labs trying to issue a statement of conformity to the directive based on their testing, but that's really not a correct thing. It doesn't really mean anything either. Okay, next question. So yeah, my comment would be, find a module manufacturer who's happy to give you the test reports would be the best thing. If they can't get the test reports, then get a notified body certificate from the module. If you can't get the results or a notified body certificate, then you really don't have any evidence that the module complies. And then you're at a full retest situation, unless you want to take a big risk. Okay, is a notified body assessment required if the installer performs partial testing according to harmonized standards to assess the integration of the module into the host? This is a good question, and this has been debated a few times before. So let's say, for example, you've got a module which has been fully CE marked and it's got a full set of test results to the harmonized standard, and then you've installed it and you've decided to trust some of the test results and repeat other test results. So some of your testing is on the final product and some of your testing is on the module. Do you need to get a notified body certificate for that? Well, if you can demonstrate that the final set of results you have is applicable to your product, then you can demonstrate you have applied the harmonized standard, and therefore you can justify that you didn't go to a notified body. And that would be things like duty cycle, if you haven't changed that, if it was measured from the module, or hopping rate of Bluetooth, that sort of thing. If you haven't changed any of that, then you can say that the measurement from the Bluetooth module was identical to how it would be from your product, and you know that because it's fixed in the DSP or the firmware of the module, and you haven't changed that. So you could therefore say that that test from that module is identical to how it would be from your product. All the other stuff like radiated emissions and EIRP and receiver performance, you couldn't say it was identical, so you would need to recheck those. As long as you can demonstrate that you have fully applied the harmonized standard, then you don't need the notified body certificate. But it is a stretch, and a lot of installers are quite uncomfortable with that. And so I think a lot of notified body applications from the end product manufacturer come about when they have installed a module. Okay, next question. So as a module manufacturer, if I use the end installer's antenna design as a test jig, and then test it, basically if the module manufacturer is testing it in the final product, I think is what they're saying, using the end product's antenna trace, antenna solution, whatever, which model name would be on the DOC and on the label of the module, and on the test reports. So the installer this person asking this question has said here that the end product manufacturer's name is on the test report. Well, firstly, it doesn't matter whose name is on the test report. It's all about who owns that product. So if that module has been developed for that product and it isn't being placed on the market for other people to ascertain, and I would say look in the EU Blue Guide at the definition of being placed on the market, because it kind of sounds here like you're not placing that module on the market, you've developed it for a specific manufacturer to use in their product. So it's almost like you're a design consultant or something, and it's not placed on the market as a module, it's being tested and integrated into that thing, in which case it's not a final product placed on the market by the sound of your question, and therefore the DOC would only exist for the final product. But if you are hoping to CE mark that module and place that module on the market with the expectation that that customer is going to buy it because you've tested it in a way that perfectly matches their installation, then you really need to look at, okay, you're placing it on the market, whose name is on that module? If your name is on that module, then you write the DOC. If that end customer's name, you've put that end customer's name on the module, then actually they are the manufacturer of the module, and so their DOC would be in their name. Okay, other side of the tennis pitch. RF exposure. EN 62479 or EN 50566. EN 62479 is on the Low Voltage Directive Official Journal, and EN 50566 is on the RED Official Journal. So which one to use? Okay, interesting question. So first thing I would say is, if you had two versions of a similar standard, one was on the Low Voltage Directive and one was in the RED, well, we're talking about radio equipment here, so the RED applies. So I would say go for the RED one. So for example, if there was a standard which could apply to radio or non-radio equipment, then, and they're both listed on, you know, LVD and RED OJs, but different versions, for example, go with the RED one. But this is two different standards, and actually the ENs, they do different things is the answer. EN 62479 2010, that is for low voltage device, low power devices, and it's almost like a SAR test exemption standard. If you look in that standard, it's a very short standard, and it says basically if you're below 20 milliwatts and it's a portable device worn on the body, then you don't need to do a SAR test because you're below 20 milliwatts. I would have thought I'd like to have seen this on the official journal for the RED, because it applies to a lot of radio transmitters. Transmitters that are below 20 milliwatts can use this standard. It's of course for the Low Voltage Directive, it's there as well because you've got things with high levels of emissions which need an RF exposure assessment, but combined come to less than 20 milliwatts. So that standard is a very short one which says if you're less than 20 milliwatts, you don't need to do a SAR test. And by the way, that's based on the concept that the SAR limit for Europe is 2 watts per kilogram. And so if you transposed 20 milliwatts into 2 watts per kilogram on a 10 gram SAR test, even if all of the 20 milliwatts was fed into your body tissue, you'd still only just meet the limit. So anything less than that is going to pass in their logic. So 50566, however, is the SAR test for body-worn equipment standard. So in answer to your question, which one do you use? My response would be, if you've got a very low power device, less than 20 milliwatts, and you want to demonstrate why you're not doing a SAR test, then use EN 62479. If you've got a higher power device that's worn on the body, then use EN 50566. If it's also held to the head, use EN 50360. And if it's sitting away from you, like more than 20 centimeters, like a Wi-Fi access point, or goes on the wall or something, then EN 50385, I think it is. It's called base station assessment one. Okay, hopefully that answers that question. There's a question here which isn't specific to modules, and I don't know the answer, but I'll read it out just because I don't like to pretend that I didn't get asked a question just because I don't know what the answer is. Just double check. So for a UKCA DOC for radio, it states compliance with the Radio Equipment Regulation 2017, Statutory Instrument 2017 as amended by 2019. Is there any timeline for reissuing the UK radio regulations as a single consolidated statutory instrument? And I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to any of those regulations if they are planning to reissue them with new dates. My very clever colleague Simon Barracliff does a great UKCA presentation, and hopefully he'll do that again soon, so maybe he'll be able to talk about that. Okay, if a radio is tested with a power supply, like a detachable power supply, and then later the power supply is changed for a different type, what tests do I recommend? Well, that's an interesting question. And it's actually quite complicated because this combined equipment thing comes into play. Like if you buy a box and it's got maybe a phone and a power supply in it, the phone is clearly radio equipment and the power supply powers the phone. So is that whole box in the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive, or is the phone in the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive and the power supply is in the scope of the EMC and low voltage directives? That's the sort of debate, but you're talking about testing. So I would say, obviously, the power supply itself needs to be passing. It needs to be passing all the safety and EMC tests. But then with regard to powering the radio product, it really comes down to what is that radio product. We're talking about radio modules here, so I don't know if you're talking about something literally providing power to a module, or if this is a general question about radio equipment. So I would say this is a port to your radio equipment, so all your EMC testing could be affected. But also if your transmitter doesn't have voltage regulation and your new power supply provides different voltage or current, you could even end up having different radio performance changed based on a new power supply. So I would say there isn't an easy answer to that simple question. Although being very similar, would we recommend you, if you're putting a radio into some other thing here, EN 303446 or EG 203367? I would say you could use them both. Neither of them are harmonized standards. You could also use TGN 01. I think if you really get down to the details in EN 303446 and EG 203367 and TGN 01 and this webinar, they all say if your installation of the module hasn't changed anything, then you don't need to test it. If it has changed something, you do need to test it. About as simple as that. So I think if you're wondering which one you might put in your risk assessment, I would say try and use them all and document them all in your risk assessment. None of them are harmonized standards, so you don't need to list them on the DOC. You might choose to list 303446 on your DOC if you wish, but I would say follow them all and use them all because they all say about the same thing. Where can one access TGN 33 and TGN 31? Good question. So the REDCA, Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association, has a website, and you can go there and you can download the TGNs. Some of them that are considered really important to industry, like TGN 01, are freely available. You click on it and you can get it. Some of the others, though, are private for the members of the REDCA, but you can email the REDCA and go to the contact us list and say, I would like a copy of this TGN, please, and probably they'll send you a copy. But then they'll also encourage you to join the REDCA, which is fair enough. Or you could contact your local friendly test lab or notified body who happens to be a REDCA member, and they might be able to talk you through that TGN. Okay, when testing radio equipment host, configure the radio in the worst case as per the module report. Sure, easier said than done, correct. Without a test tool to configure a specific 5G channel, for example, or an LTE band is almost impossible. I agree. Radio vendor generally doesn't share this confidential tool. Yeah, that's correct. This is a difficult side to installing a radio. So you've got a few choices, really. You could test it in a very normal mode. So, for example, Wi-Fi, you could just get it streaming a piece of information, have it streaming a data file, for example. LTE, for example, you could put it in an anechoic chamber, have a cable, a little localized antenna, and a cable going to the outside world, but with a step attenuator in there. And that way, it's gonna, through the cable to the outside world, it's gonna connect to a cellular base station, and then you increase the attenuation on the step attenuator so that your radio and the base station thinks that your radio is right at the very edge of the cell, and so your radio will turn its output power up. So that would be a way of putting the LTE to maximum power, for example. Of course, you can't choose which band. If you've got an LTE device with 5 different bands, then you can't do that because the base station will tell it which band to go to. If you might be able to use a cellular test set or call box. Most labs would have one of those, so you go along to the lab and you put not a normal SIM card in it, but you put the test lab's SIM card in your product so that it can talk to the test lab's cellular call box, and then the lab can set the LTE device into whichever band and whichever output power they like. But yeah, things like Bluetooth, if you can't stop it hopping, you're going to have to really slow down your spurious emission sweep and try and capture those signals, and it makes life difficult. Sorry. We see most modules have an EU type examination certificate. Yes, that's correct. I've probably issued a lot of them myself, even if the standards assessed are to harmonized. Is the EU type examination certificate mandatory for modules? No, it's not mandatory for modules because a module is simply a piece of radio equipment just like any other. However, a lot of radio module manufacturers do get EU type examination certificates, and there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the installer then has some confidence that it's a good quality module, and they go, right, okay, you say your module complies, how do I know it complies? Oh, okay, great, it's got a type examination certificate. Secondly, the installer is saying, give me your test reports, give me your schematics, give me your parts lists, and the module manufacturer can just go, no, but here's a type examination certificate. And then the installer can go, okay, so somebody has reviewed all those documents and somebody has issued a certificate to the RER based on that, on their review of the results and their review of the design of the module, and that gives the installer some confidence. As a notified body reviewing the end product, we are able to take the notified body certificate of the module into consideration. It's not transferable, but if we don't have all the test reports from the module manufacturer, we could say, well, okay, you don't seem to have any results for frequency hopping timing or duty cycle, but you do have a notified body certificate from the module, and so we know it has been tested and we know it has passed. That's a lot more than a DOC, and then the notified body of the end product should be happy to accept that, and they might call up or email the original notified body from the module, and the notified bodies can have a chat about that. So it's very useful for the module manufacturers to have the notified body certificate. Okay, I spoke about various RF exposure standards. There's a very common standard, EN 62311. This can also be used under the RER? Yes. Be a little bit careful with the older versions of EN 62311 because it didn't talk about reasonably foreseen use. The whole of the RER, your product must meet a reasonably foreseen use. In the past, a lot of RF exposure standards have been guilty of saying, test it like this, whereas actually you test it in the most conservative way possible. But yeah, people do tend to use EN 62311 as a sort of high level, right, I'm going to have a look at all RF exposure. And then once you've started looking at it, the later versions of it do include reasonably foreseen use, or worst case, if I can use that expression. And then once you started doing that, you end up tumbling down into the SAR test, the 50360 or 50566, or you conclude that it's less than 20 milliwatts and therefore based on EN 62479, you don't do a test. So it's kind of like you end up, wherever you jump in, whether you jump straight into the test standard or whether you jump into the high level standard and come down to the test standards, you end up with the same situation. You either end up with a SAR test for a high power device on the body, or no SAR test for a low power device on the body, or maybe a calculation or measurement for a device which is like a base station or a fixed product. As to what do you put on your declaration of conformity, well, that's kind of up to you. If there's a harmonized standard that applies and you did apply it, then go for that. If there are non-harmonized standards like 62311, you can list them on your DOC, but make sure, and please do that because you need to list something on your DOC. But as always, don't forget, if your standard isn't harmonized, perhaps just because it isn't yet, then make sure you document on your risk assessment why you chose that standard. And if there isn't a harmonized standard, that doesn't mean don't do anything. That means use a non-harmonized standard. Okay, right. Well, that, unless I've missed one, which I don't think I have, Laura, that is me done. I've answered all the questions.
Thanks so much, Michael, and that's great. And thank you everybody for attending. This was, as Michael said, the final part in our 4-part series. So if you've missed any of our previous sessions, these are available on our YouTube element testing channel. I'll also send links out to the previous presentations, along with the recording to today's presentation via email. And for the remainder of the year, we'll also be hosting some exciting new topics on radio into environments, including the medical, automotive and industrial sectors. We'll repeat our UKCA MAP training and also host sessions on global market access. So can look forward to those. And finally, a short survey will appear on your screen. So if you can take the time to complete this, it will help us to improve our future webinars. Thanks again, Michael, and everyone who listened today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Laura, for all your help.
Thank you. Goodbye.
All right.